Joshua chapter 10, the conquest of the south. In chapter 10, the conquest basically transfers to a new stage. If up till now, Joshua has dealt with individual cities, whether it be Jericho, Ai, and then Givon, now in chapter 10, there is a dramatic turnabout, and Joshua will not face one city, but rather a formidable coalition of no less than 5 cities, all coming from the south. So let us begin reading our chapter. And it came to pass when Adoni-Tzedek, king of Jerusalem, and by the way, this is the first explicit mention of this name, Jerusalem. We have other names that may refer to Jerusalem, like Salem, Shalem, and Moriah, found in the Torah, but Jerusalem, for the first time in the Bible, appears here. So when Adoni-Tzedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had taken Ai and had completely destroyed it, as he had done to Jericho and her king, so had he done to Ai and her king, and that the inhabitants of Givon had made peace with Israel and were among them, that they feared greatly, because Givon was a great city, as one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all her men were mighty. So we read here that the news that Givon had made peace with Israel struck fear into the hearts of the residents of Jerusalem and of their king, Adoni-Tzedek. Why so? Because here we get an explicit explanation, because Givon was considered a very mighty city. And when the people of Jerusalem heard that Givon had joined ranks and now were in treaty with Israel, this struck fear in their hearts. There may be also an additional reason to this, and which we will refer to immediately. So what does this news lead to? Verse 3, and Adoni-Tzedek, king of Jerusalem, sent to Hocham, king of Hebron we know, and to Piram, king of Yarmut, and Yafia, king of Lachish, and to Dvir, king of Eglon, saying, come up to me and help me, and we will smite Givon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the children of Israel. So Adoni-Tzedek, hearing that there is now a coalition and a treaty between Israel and Givon, decides to make his own coalition, and he calls upon other kings to the south. Hebron, we know, southern Judea. There are mentions of other places, including Yarmut, Lachish, and Eglon. As far as identifying these places, well, one is a definite identification. That is Lachish, we know. It's a famous tell that is situated southwest of Jerusalem, basically parallel to Hebron, but further to the west. As for Yarmut, we can take a look at the map. It's identified as a tell found next to modern day Beit Shemesh. You could see it here, Tel Yarmut, right? Very close to Ramat Beit Shemesh. And as far as Lachish, if we want to locate it, Lachish is well to the south, and basically paralleling Hebron. So we'll make the map a little slower. Here's Lachish, and to the east we can find the city of Hebron in the mountain range. Here you see Hebron, big city, and basically paralleling, but more to the east, more to the west, we have Lachish. So we have a coalition basically between Jerusalem to the north here, and cities in the location of Beit Shemesh, further to the west, like we said, including the identification of Tel Yarmut, close to Beit Shemesh. And with regard to Eglon, that we are less clear about, but it's proposed that it's also a little more to the southwest. So there is this coalition of 5 cities, and led by Adoni Tzedek, the king of Jerusalem, who calls upon them to help to conquer the Israelites. And the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Yarmouth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon, gathered together and went up, they and all their camps, and encamped on Givon and made war against it. Givon was a walled city. We have excavated the area of Givon. It indeed has very impressive walls, so they basically laid siege to the city. Okay, so this is a continuation of what we read already in the beginning of chapter 9, where there was a kind of transformation and the cities became more proactive. We read in the beginning of chapter 9, and it was when all the kings that were on this side of the Jordan, and on the west side, in the hill country and in the valley and on all the shore of the great sea opposite Lebanon, and then there's a list of the different nations, when they heard this, that they gathered together to war with Joshua and with Israel with a single accord. Now, what's peculiar is, whereas in the beginning of chapter 9, we see that the statement that all the nations of Canaan gathered together to wage war against Israel, and of course, with the exception of Givon, who made a peace treaty. In our chapter, we only have a list of southern kings. Why is that? Why isn't there a coalition that spans from the north, like was mentioned in chapter 9, parallel to Lebanon, till the south, and make a far more formidable coalition against the Israelites? The answer to this question may be a strategy that Joshua was able to employ here in his attack on the land of Canaan. If we look at the map, we see when Joshua crosses the Jordan, right, from the plains of Moab and Mount Nebo, they cross, they get to Jericho. You see Jericho next to that blue line here. And then he conquers the Ai, which was next to Beit El in this area. And now we know that Givon, which was a little to the west, northwest of Jerusalem, made a treaty. So you could see there's basically a pretty much almost straight line going from east to west under control of Joshua and the Israelites, from Jericho to the central mainland, right, mountains, including Ai and Givon. And this map may give us a solution to why there was only a southern coalition. It seems like Joshua basically split the country into 2. And as such, kind of disconnected the north from the south. This may be the first stage of his conquest. Once he took control of the Jordan Valley with the most important city, Jericho, under his control, and basically limiting access to the east, he's now controlling the east. He then splits the country into 2 through the heart of the land and the mountain range, and now he basically dislocated north from south, so the only possibility was making a coalition. And this may be an additional reason why Adoni Tzedek was so pressured by the Gibeonites making a treaty with Israel. He realized that he was now cut off from the north, and Joshua controls the whole center of the land, and hence he feels the necessity to break this and try to get a coalition against Joshua. So they lay siege upon the city of Givon. Let's see the response. Verse 6, and the men of Givon sent to Joshua to the camp to Gilgal, saying, do not slack your hands from your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites that dwell in the mountains are gathered together against us. One can sense the pressure here in the call of the people of Givon. they're indeed totally surrounded by many kings, this whole southern coalition, and therefore they basically send an SOS, a call for urgent help to the Israelites. How will Joshua respond to this call? Well, we remember that this treaty itself was accomplished via subterfuge and a false presentation of them being from a distant land. So we may have thought that, okay, Joshua said, yeah, right, and might have let them be conquered and not intervene. But as we shall see, Joshua lives up to the treaty. He signed the treaty, he was in agreement, he took a vow, right? And therefore he feels obliged to fulfill, not only right to promise, but also to fulfill his promise. And he is indeed going to perform and live up to the treaty that he took upon himself. So verse 7, we don't even see a response, we just see action, no verbal response. So Joshua ascended from Gilgal, remembering that Gilgal is located close to Jericho in the Jordan Valley, very low valley, and hence the verb used here, ascend, because he indeed rises up a very steep climb from the Jordan Valley till the highlands, till Givon. So Joshua ascended from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the mighty men of valor. And the Lord said to Joshua, do not fear them, for I have delivered them into your hand. Not a man of them shall stand before you. So here we see God again giving Joshua words of encouragement. We can understand why, because this is indeed a formidable, right, enemy here, a coalition of no less than 5 cities. How will Joshua be able to overcome this enemy? Let's see the tactic used. Verse 9. And Joshua came to them suddenly. He had gone up from Gilgal all night. This is basically a surprise attack. They weren't expecting Joshua to come, and Joshua marches all night from the lowlands, from the Dead Sea Valley, to surprise attack this southern coalition. And the Lord confused them before Israel and slew them with a great slaughter at Givon. So Joshua is successful in this surprise attack, right? But we see that the upper hand and the harm inflicted upon the enemy is here attributed to God. The Lord confused them before Israel and slew them with a great slaughter at Givon, and they chased them by the way that goes up to Beit Horon, and smote them to Azekah and to Makeda. So let's just give a little view of the map to understand the geography here. We see Joshua coming up from Gilgal, from down at night, all night long, coming up here through up to Givon. And here he surprise attacks them, right? It's a little north of Jerusalem, see? And what happens is they're slaughtered here, and they begin to flee, via the ascent of Beit Horon, right? There's a Beit Horon, by the way, we have a modern day Beit Horon and Mevo Horon. This ascent is actually parallel, for those who are familiar, with the second major highway connecting Jerusalem to the coastal plain. That's the highway that goes by basically Modi'in. So this is parallel. This is the Beit Horon ascent. I believe it's Highway 431, if I'm not mistaken. Let me just see if I could find it on the map to verify. Yeah, here, 431. You can see this is a parallel highway, 431, that leads up to Jerusalem. And here's the one highway, and then the 431 that is an alternative route that goes up parallel to here we go. Sorry, 443, not 431. Correction. Okay, 443 that goes up to Jerusalem. So that's basically parallels that same route, the ascent of Beit Horon, and that is exactly the area where Joshua began to chase the Southern Coalition. All right, we go back to our verses. And they continued and smote them till Azekah and to Makedah. So Makedah, we're not certain, but Azekah, we have a certain identification. Azekah is, if we go back to, here's, by the way, Mevo Horon, Beit Horon, Mevo Horon. These are basically paralleling the areas where Joshua gave chase. And if we look for Azekah, Azekah is located basically, here we go, Tel Azekah. You can see it right over here, to also in the Beit Shemesh area, not too far away. Here's Beit Shemesh, and a little southwest is Tel Azekah, nice impressive tel overlooking also the whole area as well. Okay, so he gives them chase, and then they start first going towards the west, and then travel, and then starting to move downwards south. And here you see Azekah, the movement downwards. Okay, and here we have a mention of something incredible that occurs as they are fleeing away from the Israelites. Verse 11. And it was, as they fled from before Israel and were in the descent of Beit Horon, that the Lord cast down great stones from heaven upon them to Azekah, and they died. There were more who died with the hailstones than whom the children of Israel slew with the sword. So here we see the great divine intervention and the slaying of many of the enemy here via kind of like an asteroid shower, if you will, some kind of hailstone shower, which kills many of the fleeing enemy. And if that weren't enough, we continue to read of one of the most famous miracles in the book of Joshua and perhaps in the Bible, that we read in verse 12. Then Joshua spoke to the Lord on the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel. And he said in sight of Israel, sun, stand still upon Givon, and moon in the valley of Ayalon. And it's even a rhyme. We'll hear the Hebrew. Shemesh begivon dom veyareach be'emek Ayalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed, until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Yashar? So the sun stood still in the midst of the heaven, and it did not hasten to go down exactly a whole day. And there was no day like that before it or after it, that the Lord hearkened to the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. So we here have a second miracle. And this miracle involves apparently the sun and the moon, and taken literally, it would seem to imply that they simply stopped moving. And so that there was a situation where simultaneously, apparently, the sun stood upon Givon, and the moon stood in the valley of Ayalon. If we go back to our map, here we'll look at this one. So we have here the valley of Ayalon. It's a famous valley. That's, by the way, the major highway leading up to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv goes through Ayalon, right? The valley of Ayalon. And so we have the sun was upon Givon, which is to the east, and the moon was in the valley of Ayalon. What exactly occurred here that both were simultaneous? Well, to see simultaneously the sun and the moon is something that we can witness quite often. Every month, part of the cycle, you can see in the last quarter, pretty much, that you could see both bodies simultaneous. As far as the directions, we could learn that we are talking about a morning hour here, because if the sun is in Givon, it would be to the east and the moon would be to the west. So the sun was in a rising situation from the east and the moon was in a setting situation to the west. So what is exactly going on here, and what is such a miracle? So here there are different possibilities raised. Taken literally, it would seem that simply something slowed down in the rotation of the earth, right? Hence, you don't see the celestial bodies move, which is indeed an incredible miracle. And some wanted to make calculations that some time seems to have been lost in astronomic terms. Some wanted to bring proof for such a possibility. That's one option. That's the more literal and common understanding. And how this works, God knows, it's a miracle, right? Others suggest to view this more as figurative language, and saying that basically Joshua is calling upon the celestial bodies to take part and to help the Israelites in their victory. And what lends possibility to this is that it's awkward that such a demand would be given by Joshua, or a request and prayer by Joshua to God in the morning, because it seems like this is to slow down time, but you still have plenty of time in the morning. So maybe it's just like a figurative kind of pronouncement that the celestial bodies also partook in this war and helped and were witnesses to the victory of the Israelites. That is a second possibility. A third option, which I prefer, is that this may be something which was sensed subjectively. In other words, Joshua basically tells the bodies to slow down, and hence the Israelites felt that they had more time. Time moved, subjectively a lot slower than it usually does, and that was what was miraculous in this instance. However we approach it, it's clear that this is described as a very unique event. It's even given support from an external body, another book, the Sefer HaYashar, the book of Yashar, right? Is this a quote, or is this just a reference to another book? Both possibilities are raised, and if it's a quote, what exactly is a quote from the book? In any event, what is clear is that the book of Joshua rests and gets some of its information from other books as well. And this book being called the Book of Yashar, which is mentioned also in the book of Samuel, when King David pronounces to teach after the fall of Saul, that the importance of teaching the Israelites how to use a bow and arrow. And he writes it in the book of Yashar. But we don't have that book, unfortunately, but we do see that it was a book that was used by the compilers of the Bible. What remains to be understood is we obviously have tremendous miracles here, both this kind of asteroid shower of rocks and some slowing of time, whether objective or subjective. The question that we should that arises here is, why do we need such awesome miracles in this instance? For we have already read that the Israelites overcame this southern coalition. They're already victorious in verse 10. It said, and the Lord confused them before Israel and slew them with a great slaughter at Givon. So they already overcame the enemy at Givon. So why do we need, right, these tremendous miracles? These miracles are brought in order to provide victory. Here, the victory was accomplished just by the tactic of a surprise attack after that all-night march by Joshua. And we have these most awesome of miracles, perhaps unparalleled in the Bible, and they seem to be post-victory, right? Just, maybe additional, right, damage inflicted upon the enemy, but not what determined the outcome, which was already a victory for Israel right off in the initial attack. So why, in this instance, do we have such great miracles? For that, we can, I think, learn, first of all, by the statement that the point here is not just to be victorious. The point here was to wipe out this southern coalition, not just to allow them to flee. It's true, Joshua already overcame them, saved Givon, but they're in the midst of fleeing. Now, if they get away, so a lot of the enemy will remain. And the purpose here is, of course, to conquer and inherit the land. And therefore, the miracles come in very handy. Like the verse itself states, there were more who died from the hailstone than that the children of Israel slew, because they died right when they were fleeing. And that could also explain that the purpose of that miracle of the sun and the moon, of time slowing down. Why is it so critical here? Well, the Israelites have to, if they want to destroy this enemy, have to do so during the light hours, right? Because once darkness falls, well, every single individual will be able to, under cover of night, slip by, and it's going to be very hard to capture all of the enemy. And hence what Joshua asks is, give us more time, let there be more light hours. And that is exactly what happens. God responds by indeed giving them apparently more time, whether it be subjective or objective, giving them more light hours. And then God heeds that call. And we're informed how this is a very unique event. There was no day like that before and after it, that the Lord hearkened to the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Right? So here we really see Joshua calling out and telling God, right, to help, and God responding and doing as Joshua requests. And this brings us to verse 15, which seems to summarize, and Joshua returned and all Israel with him to the camp to Gilgal. Now, this is the end of the first section. The chapter itself is actually composed of, we can say, 4 sections. The section that we just read till verse 15, with a clear summation of Joshua returning to the Jordan Valley to Gilgal. And then the second section from verse 16 till verse 27 deals with the capture and eventual doing away and killing of the 5 kings themselves, right? And then the third section from verse 28 till verse 39 deals with the conquest of cities in the south. And then the last 3 verses from verse 40 to 43 summarize the whole conquest in the south. So we have these 4 sections, and what is peculiar is that the second section, which we're about to begin reading continues on with the war, whereas in verse 15 we read that Joshua returned to Gilgal as if the war was over. And this, of course, stymied and perplexed all commentators. The early commentators, for example, Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, from the 12th century and beginning of the 13th, he proposed that Joshua thought that the war was over, went back to the east to Gilgal in the Jordan Valley. Oh, and then he heard that they captured the 5 kings, as we will be reading onwards in verse 16. So he returned. But this seems very unlikely. And indeed, the Abarbanel, Don Isaac Abarbanel, the 15th century, originally from Portugal, commentator, lashes out at that and says it's ridiculous to think that they went back to the east and then came back. That doesn't make sense. So Abarbanel, he proposes counter to Rabbi David Kimchi, the commentator from the area of Provence. He proposes no, that the whole chapter is built as a general description and a more specific description. So we get like what's called a klal, a general overview of the war, and then an elaboration with some more details later on. So it's clear that in the middle, Joshua didn't go back to the east, but rather it's all one event. We should point out that this verse that summarizes Joshua returned to the Gilgal is paralleled with the identical verse later on in the summary after all the conquest at the end. Look at the end of the chapter, and Joshua returned, and all Israel with him to the camp to Gilgal. Right, so we basically have almost identical verses. Right, verse 43 paralleling our verse in verse 15, and Joshua and all Israel returned with him to the camp in Gilgal. What are we to do with these identical verses? So, for starters, we should state that these verses don't appear in the Old Greek. And that might be a sign that these were verses that were added a little later in a later stage of editing. But then why are they added twice? So this may be just a scribal error. That's one possibility. But I think more probable this is that maybe this is a sign that there were indeed different sources, as most diachronic scholars propose, that there were different sources recounting a war in the southern area that were merged here, and maybe each source had its own conclusion, or maybe there was a separate editorial stage of adding that summary to each of the sources, and then a third stage where they were merged together. So it's basically a product of the stages of redaction and compilation of the book, where there might have been 2 separate sources, which each got a summary in of itself, and then they were merged together. Or a third possibility, which may be even more intricate, is that perhaps this was purposefully done in order to break the descriptions and separate between them. And if that's the case, we're going to have to try to understand why so. Why is there a break between the descriptions? As if from a literary perspective, the compilers wanted us to distinguish between 2 accounts of the victory in the south. In any event, we will continue reading the second section now, which recounts how Joshua captured and killed the kings of this coalition. And these 5 kings fled and hid themselves in a cave at Makkedah. We don't have a definite identification of Makkedah, but it is probably located in the Beit Guvrin area, southwest. And Joshua was told, saying, the 5 kings have been found hidden in a cave at Makkedah. So this is definitely a very important stage in the war. When can you say that you have been victorious? When you have captured the king, right, the leader of your enemy. Let's see how Joshua responds. And Joshua said, roll great stones to the mouth of the cave and appoint men by it to guard them. And don't you stay, pursue your enemies and smite the hindmost of them. Do not let them enter their cities, for the Lord your God has delivered them into your hand. So surprisingly, Joshua is not very excited about this, but he basically informs his soldiers, oh, don't pay attention, block those kings in their cave, set guard on the cave, and don't waste your time. Continue giving chase. And it was when Joshua and the children of Israel had made an end of slaying them with a very great slaughter until they were consumed, that the rest which remained of them entered the fortified cities. So basically, we're informed that indeed the Israelites continued giving chase. Many were slaughtered, and only a few, the remnants of the enemy, were able to get to their fortified cities in the south. And all the people returned to the camp to Joshua to Makkedah. So we see that Joshua is still in the area. He didn't go down to Gilgal, but he's in that area. They returned to Makkedah in peace. None wetted his tongue against any of the children of Israel. In other words, this is a translation of the Hebrew, Lo charatz livnei Israel ish et leshono. Nobody called out, no tongue lashed out against the Israelites, a sign that no harm came upon the Israelites. And Joshua said, open the mouth of the cave and bring out those 5 kings to me from the cave. And they did so. And they brought forth those 5 kings to him from the cave, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Yarmut, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon. And it was when they brought out these kings to Joshua that Joshua called for all the men of Israel and said to the chiefs of the men of war that went with him, come near, put your feet upon the necks of these kings. And they came near and put their feet upon their necks. And Joshua said to them, fear not, nor be dismayed. Be strong and of good courage. For thus shall the Lord do to all your enemies against whom you fight. So it's clear that Joshua here wants to encourage all his soldiers and his captains in the army. Therefore, he tells them to step upon the necks of these kings and thereby encourage them. Note the terminology used here: chizku ve'imtzu, right? Be strong and of good courage. Well, that should ring a bell for those who recall. In the first chapter, the opening chapter, this was like the repeating statement throughout the chapter. God told Joshua, "Chazak ve'ematz, be strong and be courageous." And the 2.5 tribes told Joshua, "Be strong and be courageous." What do we see here? That whereas in chapter 1, everybody was encouraging Joshua, now in our chapter 10, it is Joshua who is encouraging everybody else, including all his chiefs in the army, to be strong and courageous. And then Joshua does away with them, and afterwards Joshua smote them and slew them and hanged them on 5 poles. And they were hanging upon the poles until the evening. We see this violence, right, which is basically done publicly and clearly a manner that is used to show the power and the great victory here, and to encourage, right, all the Israelites to have to be with confidence in their wars. So he has them hanging. We might be a little appalled of this kind of norms, which we're not used to. But note what verse 27 states. And it was at the time of the setting of the sun. So here we also have mention of the sun. We remember the miracle of the sun. The sun did not hurry to set as usual. But it was at the time of the setting of the sun that Joshua commanded, and they took them down off the poles and cast them into the cave wherein they had been hidden, and laid great stones on the mouth of the cave until this very day. So what we see is that Joshua nevertheless has them hanging only until the setting of the sun, and then he commands to bring them down and kind of buries them in that cave. So this whole unit opens with the news of the 5 kings being located in a cave, and then they're being basically hemmed in there and closed in there by big stones. And then at the end, after they were hanged, they are brought down and basically buried there, once again covered by these great stones, and until this very day, namely until, I guess, the period in which the story was compiled. So we kind of have a similar opening and ending of this second stage of the narrative, focusing on the 5 kings. Now, interestingly enough, when we compare these 2 sections, namely the first 15 verses of the war, and then the second stage, we can find that there are interesting kind of parallels between these 2. What do these parallels include? Well, for one, both stories have a description of big stones, right? We had the massive stones flying from the sky and hitting and doing away with many of the fleeing enemy. And we have the mention of those big stones, right, that were used to cover the cave and eventually bury the 5 kings. In both sections, we have words of encouragement, right? In the first section, we have God in verse 8 telling Joshua not to fear. Let's take a look at verse 8. The Lord said to Joshua, "Do not fear them." So this is God encouraging Joshua not to have fear. But interestingly enough, we have also similar words of encouragement in verse 25. And Joshua said to them, "Fear not, nor be dismayed." Al tiru, similar language. So we have words of encouragement. In the first section of the narrative, we have God encouraging Joshua, and in the second one, we have Joshua encouraging the people. By the way, if we compare it also with regard to the stones, in the first section, we have God bringing down stones upon the enemy, right? The Lord cast down great stones from heaven upon them. And in our second section, it is the Israelites themselves. Joshua commands to roll great stones on the mouth of the cave. So it's like a similar kind of parallel, but once focusing on God bringing great stones or giving words of encouragement, and the other focusing on Joshua and the people. Joshua giving words of encouragement, and the Israelites being commanded by Joshua to roll big stones upon the mouth of the cave. By the way, we can add to this that both sections have this focus on giving chase and trying to eradicate as much of the enemy, not wasting time, right? in the first section, we have the request that time kind of slows down, right? And this, right, the sun standing still, that we find in the description of the verse, and the sun stood still, right? In verse 13, Vaidom Hashemesh v'yareach amad, and the moon stayed, the moon also stood. Interestingly enough, that same verb in Hebrew, amad, right? We also find with Joshua commanding his soldiers, right? Don't you stay, right? That's a translation of the Hebrew in verse 19. Vatem al ta'amodu. It's the same root, amad, right? And interestingly, we can also see the verb lavo. Ve'al titnum lavo el arehem. Do not let them enter their cities. The verb lavo. We have the verb amad and lavo, and it's interesting that we have those two verbs also in the description of the moon, right? Ve'yarech amad, the moon stood, right? Velo atzlavo, and with regard to the sun, did not come lo lavo, right? The sun stood still in the midst of the heaven and did not hasten to go. We have the same descriptions of standing and not going, but in the first section, it's related to the moon and the sun. The moon stood, amad, and the sun is not coming. And in the second section, we have Joshua commanding the Israelites not to stand, right? And in order to not allow the people to come, lavo el arehem, to enter their cities. So we see in both sections, right, great emphasis on giving chase and making use of time to do away with as much as the enemy as can possibly be done within the context of the time available. And finally, we have a summary of the effect and all the damage inflicted upon the enemy. We find this both in similar language, both in verse 10 and in verse 20. So in verse 10, we read, Vayakem makagdola, and the Lord confused them before Israel and slew them with a great slaughter. Note the word makeh, right, in Hebrew, right? He slew them, vayakem makagdola. And in verse 20, in the second section, once again, we have that same root, lahakot, but this time, vayikechalot Yehoshua of Israel lahakotam makagdola. Similar language, right? And it was when Joshua and the children of Israel had made an end of slaying them with a very great slaughter, right? So it's reminiscent of that language, but this time it's Joshua and Israel who have slayed them with a very great slaughter, as opposed to in verse 9, that it was the Lord who confused them and slew them with a great slaughter. So we have basically two summaries of the victory. Such parallels between two sections are quite fascinating, right? The first section, the initial attack upon Givon, and the surprise night attack, and then the great miracles that occur when they're fleeing down to the west and eventually southwest, with two massive miracles of stones falling and time slowing down. And the second section focusing on a non-miraculous account of how the kings are captured, and Joshua encouraging his soldiers to continue giving chase and not stopping and not allowing the enemy to get away, with two victories, two words of encouragement. We have kind of two parallel stories, both of them victorious, but very different in emphasis. And obviously the major difference being with the first section has a focus on the divine aspect of divine and miraculous intervention leading to the victory. And the second one focusing on Joshua as a leader in a non-miraculous way, right? Leading, encouraging, and prodding his soldiers to give chase and do away with as much as possible of the enemy. It seems like there's a dual aspect to this victory, miraculous, divine, and natural, led by Joshua, as if it's very important for the story to give kind of equal status and role in this victory, both to God and to Joshua. And indeed, I think we can see a great emphasis in this chapter on the status of Joshua, like the verse said, right? There was no day, in verse 14, there was no day like that before it or after it. The Lord hearkened to the voice of a man, right? We see the status of Joshua reaching such high elevation in the description of the victory, and we see Joshua at the end doing away with the 5 kings and bringing them to burial by nightfall. This, of course, is reminiscent of the actual command found in the book of Deuteronomy. We have in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 21, that explicitly states in verse 22, if a man commits a sin for which he is sentenced to death, and he is put to death, you shall then hang him on a pole. But you shall not leave his body on the pole overnight. Rather, you shall bury him on that same day. For a hanging human corpse is a blasphemy of God, and you shall not defile your land, which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. This is a very strict commandment. You can hang somebody, but you must bring him to burial. You can't leave him hanging overnight, because this is a blasphemy against God. Even your enemy, or even a person who's punished, who is deserving of this very harsh death penalty. Nevertheless, every human is in the image of God, and you have to respect also the human body, even of your enemies. Therefore, you have to bring them to burial. And this is indeed what Joshua does. Once again, we see the aspect of Joshua keeping the commands of the Lord, even in the setting of the conquest and war. Okay, we go back. So this was the second section, which concluded with verse 27, the burial of the 5 kings. Now, this section and these verses of the victory in the south have certain verses that I think arouse parallels, and I'm sure some of you even thought of them as we read with what happened in the Exodus from Egypt, right? As what we recall in the Passover holiday, some of these verses are very much reminiscent of what we read in the Torah, in the description of how God saved the Israelites. And this continues, I believe, this analogy between Joshua and Moses, which we read throughout the whole book of Joshua. For one, in verse 14, we had the statement that God was fighting for Israel, right? Let's just see it again. In Hebrew, Ki Hashem nilcham liYisrael, translated, for the Lord fought for Israel. Now, a description of the Lord fighting for Israel, right, in verse 14, is reminiscent of what we find in the book of Exodus in chapter 14, with the account of the splitting of the Red Sea, or the Reed Sea, right? First, God informs Moses, right? And then Moses tells the people, the Lord will fight for you, but you shall remain silent. Don't worry, the people and Moses himself are very pressured when they see the Egyptians giving chase. And then God informs them that he will help them. And then Moses tells the people, the Lord will fight for you. And this is what the Egyptians themselves sense later on, right? What do they say in verse 25? And the Egyptians said, "Let me run away from the Israelites because the Lord is fighting for them. Ki Hashem nilcham b'Mitzrayim. The Lord is fighting against them, against the Egyptians." So we see that similar terminology of the Lord fighting for the Israelites. That's one parallel relating to the crossing of the Red Sea. Another verse which strikes a very clear parallel is that the description of how no harm befell the Israelites in verse 21. Let's take a look once again. Verse 21 says, "And all the people returned to the camp to Joshua to Makkedah in peace. None wetted his tongue against any of the children of Israel." In other words, none called out, nobody cursed, nobody assaulted the Israelites. In Hebrew, "Lo charatz livnei Israel ish et leshono." Now, this language is very much reminiscent of the description of the 10th plague, where the firstborn of the Egyptians were afflicted. There was a great cry throughout the entire land of Egypt. This is in chapter 11 in Exodus. So there was that great cry coming out of Egypt, but we're informed, but to all the children of Israel in verse 7, not one dog will wet its tongue against them. In other words, right? Lo yecheratz, with regard to Bnei Israel, lo yecheratz keleb leshono. A dog wouldn't even take out his tongue, would not even bark out against Israel. That's a saying showing no harm befell the Israelites in the 10th plague. It only afflicted the Egyptians. So that's another clear linguistic parallel between what we read here and what we read in the Exodus from Egypt. And on top of that, we obviously have other parallels. For example, the stones falling from the sky are obviously reminiscent of one of the plagues, right? The hail, barad, the hail plague, which afflicted the Egyptians. So in both instances, we have, right, something falling out of the sky and killing the enemy. Another parallel, but in a form of contrast, is in this instance, the text implies in Joshua that time stood still in order to give more hours of light, right? So we could say that there's kind of like a miraculous divine intervention of light. Now, there's another miraculous intervention in the Exodus from Egypt, but it's opposite. And of course, I'm referring to the plague of darkness, right? The second to last plague. And so it's kind of like we have, in both instances, divine intervention playing with time miraculously, but in an opposite manner. Could be that this is also symbolic of like the darkness of exile as opposed to the light in the land of Israel. But in any event, I think we have here so many parallels, and this continues that extended parallel of trying to draw a comparison between the leadership of Joshua and their leadership of God. If we recall, the big question facing us as readers and the Israelites in the beginning of the book of Joshua was, will God be with Joshua as he was with Moses? Will Joshua be able to fill in the great shoes of Moses as leader? And I think one of the points of the whole book is to show indeed God was with Joshua. And in this chapter, it seems as if Joshua reaches the highest level, where it's explicitly stated, never before has there been such an event where God heeded a command of a human being, this instance being Joshua. Okay, this brings us to this third part, which is basically a list, itinerary of verses of cities in the south conquered by Joshua, beginning in verse 28 till 39. So we'll quickly just go through them and see the cities that were conquered. And on that day, Joshua took Makkedah and smote it with the edge of the sword, and its king he utterly destroyed, them and all the souls that were therein. he let none remain. And he did to the king of Makeda as he had done to the king of Jericho. So that city next to where the cave in which the kings were hiding was captured and totally destroyed, as was their king. This was not a city that was initially part of the coalition, but Joshua took advantage and destroyed them. We don't have a definite identification of Makeda. Different options have been raised, but the city and the king were destroyed. And of course, as far as the transfer from the previous section, we were indeed informed that the Israelites gave chase and chased as much as they could. And there was a remnant, however, that reached the cities, right? Only those who remained in verse 20, and the rest which remained of them entered the fortified cities. And now we move on to the next stage of the conquest of fortified cities in the area. So the first one was Makeda, and Joshua passed on from Makeda and all Israel with him to Libnah, and he fought against Libnah. And the Lord delivered also and its king into the hand of Israel, and smote it with the edge of the sword, and all the souls that were therein. He let none remain in it, and he did to its king as he had done to the king of Jericho. So in the south, we have like a continuation of the initial conquest in Jericho, destroying the whole city and all its people. We also don't have a definite identification of Libnah. And Joshua passed on from Libnah and all Israel with him to Lachish, and encamped against it and fought against it. And the Lord delivered Lachish into the hand of Israel, and he took it on the second day. I guess it took a little longer, and smote it with the edge of the sword, and all the souls that were in it, according to all that he had done to Libnah. Right. So in this instance, Lachish is conquered. No mention of the king, because the king Lachish is one of the cities in the coalition, and its king was already killed, so there's no king to take care of. In this instance, they didn't manage to set a new king upon them, but the city itself was destroyed. Lachish, as was mentioned, we do have a definite identification of Lachish. It's located southwest, basically parallel southerly to Hebron, a very important city with a very impressive tell that has been excavated with very important findings. Here I can give you a picture of the tell, right? It's actually very striking. I've been there. It overlooks the whole coastal plain, quite high, next to the modern kibbutz Lachish. It's an area with a lot of vineyards. Many of the grapes sold in Israel are grown exactly in this area. You can see even in the picture what would seem to probably be, I'm quite certain, are vineyards here. And this is Lachish. Very important findings, been excavated and continually excavated with impressive archaeological findings. So Lachish was destroyed. By the way, the archaeology indeed showed that Lachish was destroyed in the 12th century. In fact, it was destroyed twice, once in the middle of the 12th century, about 1150, and shortly after, once again, at 1130. It was burnt and razed again, and was only reconstructed later on in the time of the kings, the Israelite kings. So Lachish itself was destroyed, and then we're informed then Horam, king of Gezer, came up to help Lachish, and Joshua smote him and his people until he left none remaining. So Gezer, we also have a clear identification of. Gezer is located more northerly. It's close to Lydia. Lod, further up north, a very important city located on crossroads. It's mentioned later on in the Bible as well, given later by an Egyptian king to King Solomon. It has amazing fortifications which may have been built by Moses, similar to Megiddo. Right, so the king of Gezer here came in to try to help Lachish. I guess there was some pact between them, and this allowed the Israelites to take care of the people of Gezer. The city itself was not conquered. Like I said, it remained standing and was later given by Pharaoh as a present to King Solomon. But the people and the king here are destroyed. And from Lachish, Joshua passed on to Eglon and all Israel with them, and they encamped it against it and fought against it. And they took it on that day and smote it with the edge of the sword, and all the souls that were in it he completely destroyed that day, according to all that he had done to Lachish. And Joshua went up from Eglon, and all Israel with him to Hebron, and they fought. Now he goes further south, and they fought against it, and they took it and smote it with the edge of the sword, and its king and all its cities. Apparently, another king was coronated there, and all the souls that were in it, and he left none remaining, according to all that he had done to Eglon, but destroyed it completely and all the souls that were in it. And Joshua returned and all Israel with him to Dvir, and he fought against it and took it and its king and all the cities thereof, and they smote them with the edge of the sword and completely destroyed all the souls that were in it. He left none remaining. As he had done to Hebron, so he did to Dvir and to its king, as he had done also to Libnah and to her king. So we have here basically a list of 7 cities. It could be that we have a typological number of 7 cities that were conquered by Joshua, Makedah, and Livna, and Lachish, and Gezer, and Eglon, and Hebron, and Dvir. If we take a look at the map to see the location here, you could see, so Joshua gets to Givon, and then he gives chase first in the ascent of Beit Horon, and this is where the rocks fell, and then they start fleeing southwest, and then he conquers, right, Makedah. This is the Emek of Ayalon, right, where the moon stood. Then Makedah, and Livna, Lachish, continue giving chase, right? Eglon, Hebron, Dvir, right? So we can see the southern campaign here. Strategically, if we could analyze what's happening, whereas Joshua first controlled the crossings of the Jordan River, Jericho, and therefore basically dislocated the east from the west, then cut the land of Canaan in 2, dividing between north and south, controlling the whole central area of the land. Now he's making many conquests in the foothills, the south western foothills, right? Basically taking control and cutting off the coastal plain from the mountain range. Right, he's controlling the lower foothills facing the coastal plain. So we can see a gradual control of the whole south of the land. We will move to the concluding 4th section, the last verses that summarize the victories. So first, verse 40, and Joshua smote all the country of the hills and of the south, and of the valley, and of the falls. This is a translation of the word Ashedot, which is unclear, mountain breaks, and all their kings. He left none remaining, but destroyed every soul, as Lord God of Israel had commanded. So we have a summary of the whole geographical area, the mountains, the south, right, including the lowlands there. He conquered, and he also destroyed the kings, and the people, just as the Lord God had commanded. Then we move on to verses 41 and 42. And Joshua smote them from Kadesh Barnea to Gaza, and all the land of Goshen to Givon, right? So we have here kind of like boundaries, right? In the south, west, Goshen is not the Goshen probably that we read about in the land of Egypt, but another Goshen in the area till Givon. Here we have kind of boundaries that Joshua took control of. And all these kings, right? Not only areas, but also their kings and their land did Joshua take at one time, because the Lord God of Israel fought for Israel. Now, when we read these summaries, we get a sense of kind of repetition, because what we read in 41 and 42 seems to echo what we read in verse 40, right? In both sections, we have Joshua smiting, right? The same terminology, and Joshua smote, and Joshua smote, translation of vayakeh, vayakem, same verb, Joshua smiting. In both areas, in both sections, we have a description of the extent that was conquered. In verse 40, the geographical areas, the topographical, right, delineation of the areas, the south, the hills, the valley, and here like border locations, locales and the borders that he took control of. In both areas, we also have the mention of the conquest of the kings, in verse 40, and all their kings. So too in verse 42, and all these kings. Furthermore, in both verses, we have a reference to God, as the Lord God of Israel had commanded in verse 40, and in verse 42, because the Lord God of Israel fought for Israel. So when we get this comparison, it seems like we have kind of two parallel summaries. Now, of course, this is not surprising, because just as we had kind of two parallel descriptions of the victory, when we drew the comparison between the first section, the divine miraculous intervention in the initial attack, and then the capture of the 5 kings in the second section, two quite parallel with massive stones, words of encouragement, a summary of the victory. So too, we find two parallel summaries, which leads us to the possibility that perhaps indeed we have here a combination of two summaries, and perhaps we had two accounts that were eventually merged together to summarize the conquest of the south. And we can indeed point out to a difference between the two summaries, which would parallel the difference between the two sections of the war, where verse 40 emphasizes how Joshua smote, right, and does what God commanded, but it's Joshua who's doing it. Whereas 41, 42, we have the summary, because the Lord God of Israel fought for Israel, kind of an emphasis more on God having done all the fighting. So we could say that perhaps the second section, 41, 42 of the summary, parallels the first conquest narrative of the south, and the first verse of the summary, verse 40, focusing on Joshua, it would be like a summary of the second section of how Joshua did away with the 5 kings. In any event, the last verse of the chapter indeed parallels that earlier verse that we saw at the end, in verse 15, at the end of the first section. And Joshua returned, and all Israel with him, to the camp to Gilgal. This is indeed the concluding verse of the whole conquest. And we could state at this point, Joshua and the Israelites have taken control of the whole south of the land of Canaan, right? What remains, of course, is everything to the north. When and how will that be accomplished? Well, we'll have to stay tuned to the next chapter in the following lecture.